It
You're
happens.
locked into the Hal Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide.
Welcome back. So Philip Ittner is live in Ukraine with us today, and I wanted to talk to him about this story that's in the Daily Beast called "Brutal Sect of Putin's Army Accused of Murdering Their Own Comrades." Now, their own comrades, I think, should be in air quotes to some degree, considering who it is. And the fact that it's called brutal sect of Putin's army shows that there's, a special separate group that don't view themselves as, the comrades necessarily of those other people. So in Bucha, this guy, Ihor Yushchenko, 61, a former colonel in the Ukrainian armed forces who once served as a deputy chief of staff for ground forces in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, watched in horror as a war crime took place right outside his window in broad daylight. According to Yushchenko, a column of Russian troops advancing through the town stopped and opened fire on his street in central Bucha on February 27th, killing 2 pedestrians. This column had included Chechen fighters known as the Kadyrovsky. Members of various military groupings who are loyal to Chechnya's local strongman, Ramzan Kadyrov, known as Putin's soldier. Yushchenko said he was able to identify them by their black garb, their use of Islamic slogans, and Kadyrov's name on their body armor. About an hour later, the column was decimated by the Ukrainian army in a different part of town, but the Kadyrovsky returned. Many Chechen soldiers penetrated the street to kill Ukrainian civilians, he told the Daily Beast. And he described the Chechen fighters, also dressed in black. They shot up a car with as many as 30 bullets, and then he said they dragged the dead people out, took the car, and drove off in it. Yushchenko's mother, his friend Pavel Kondratyev, and his neighbor Bogdan each confirmed these events to the Daily Beast. According to Bogdan, however, the Chechens then hit a civilian who'd been trying to flee the scene with the car, leaving him hanging off the hood before he slid off into the street. They also talk about back and forth with these, when they're in that area, they were occupying Bucha for a time. And he goes, according to Huron, Ukrainian citizens were not the only people the Kadyrovsky allegedly brutalized in the town. Huron said that the residents he spoke to in Berdyanka, which lies northwest of Bucha, recounted what Kadyrovsky did with injured Russian soldiers they brought there from Bucha. They would bring heavily wounded Russian soldiers to a big hospital they had there, and those who were very heavily wounded, they would just shoot them. And no one other than the Kadyrovsky did this.
Yeah, I mean, they're a very different part of the Russian military, the Chechens.
Right.
Look, we could talk about this for an extended period of time. The Chechens, the Kadyrovsky, are these guys that they're the ones that conquered Chechnya for Putin, and they did it in an extremely brutal way by killing their own. Basically, by not only killing, but raping, kill gangs going through villages. These guys act, and they were done. They were formed to do that kind of stuff by Putin. Because when Putin went in for the Second Chechen Civil War, or the Second Chechen War, he was deathly afraid of losing it because it was so devastating for Yeltsin. And just to finish my point from the last segment, that ended because a lot of the grandmothers, the babushki, said, and they went to Yeltsin and said, stop this stupid war. And he, being a weak leader, he did. And and Putin didn't want to repeat that. So he was going to do everything he possibly could to win the Second Chechen War. And he was incredibly brutal. And he employed Kadyrov to be basically his warlord on the ground. And Kadyrov is a vile, vile guy. He and his followers did stuff in Chechnya that were horrific. I mean, and we don't know the full extent of what happened in Chechnya, due in no small part because actually the Russian journalists who were reporting about it and had been preparing reports about it, most notably a woman by the name of Anna Polikovskaya, ended up dead. And the Chechens have been given an awful lot of license in Russia to silence any opposition to the Kremlin, to Putin's Kremlin. And so he's basically let them off the leash in Ukraine, and they are brutal. I mean, I spoke to a family from Bucha just yesterday, and they said actually the Russians weren't that bad. The Russians showed up and they were like, you know, they checked us and they spoke to us, and but they let us go. Whereas we are some of the people who stayed. The second wave were these Chechens and guys from the Far East,
Right.
that acted in a completely different way. Now the reports that we're hearing and the stuff in the Daily Beast, I mean, it fits with their behavior because they used to do it to their own people in Chechnya, and they've been running around Russia doing hit squads. I mean, they're just they're the guys that do the dirty work for Putin.
They're meant to clean the place out, and it's interesting because I've been looking back over the last week to the bombing of Aleppo, for example, and its parallels then. And I was, because part of it was I was struck by, I think at one point I was looking for new information on, there was a bombing that they had sent, I think the one in Lviv, and then there was another. And in looking for them, Google isn't great with time sometimes. It just gives you what, it kind of pops up. And I was like, I saw, a building that I had not seen before sort of cratered in the center, as a lot of these apartment buildings we see are almost identical.
Yep.
And it was another, apartment place. And I was like, well, where is that? And when I clicked on I looked at the bottom of the link before I looked at it, and it was from 2016. It was actually a picture from Aleppo and this month-long bombing campaign that the Russians engaged in, with the effectively the approval of Assad, just leveling to whatever limit he was cool with the city of Aleppo. This is not new, and when they can, they don't mind the idea of starting from scratch. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, so you might as well blow the place to smithereens and force your own people to build whatever you want there, because you're not going to want what they had. What would you want the structure of a functioning government and normal businesses for if what you're installing is a gangster kleptocracy? So a lot of it, you don't need the Starbucks to stand. You certainly don't need the Hilton to be exist in, or whatever their variation there is. And you don't need the government offices to stand, because that's if there's a resistance, they're going to use whatever material support they can get left over from the previous government there.
Yeah, and the fact that this report is saying that these were guys who were heavily wounded. Well, taking care of the heavily wounded is not only problematic on the battlefield and in a war zone, because you're supposed to be, your focus should be on killing the enemy, not on intensive surgical. At least that's we when we get guys who are severely wounded, we get them out of the war zone.
Right.
We send them to Landstuhl in Germany, and then onward back to Walter Reed. Because it sounds callous, but look, war is callous, and it's brutal. And if you've got heavily wounded people, you're putting reserves, your material to taking care of them. So I in the mentality of those guys, I could absolutely see them saying, it's less of a drain on us to just end you here,
right,
than it is for us to patch you up or even rehabilitate you some, and then before sending you to the rear.
Americans have seen many stories of guys who were brutal, couldn't be moved, weren't going to survive the move, and who've been given morphine in battle during World War II, for example, or even in Vietnam, as even war crime victims. The idea that at some point, UN peacekeepers or American soldiers at some point have found somebody who's so disfigured by the forces that had come through that they couldn't even lift them onto a stretcher without killing them, and yet they don't want to leave them to suffer. So they make these decisions like, do we give them morphine, enough to take the pain away and a little more to make them go away in that moment? It's horrifying, right? That decision when it's being made. But that's oftentimes months, years into a conflict that involves, cut off supply lines on a massive scale and stuff. This is relative. I mean, this is pathetically early.
Yeah.
These are, because remember, these are stories from Bucha from weeks ago, from like 3 weeks ago. They're talking about.
There's also another major difference here, and that when we talk about that, generally it causes us, deep, distress to hear these stories, but the mentality is, as horrible as this is, and I hate to even say it, but it's true. The mentality is put that person out of their suffering. That's when we hear stories of that kind of stuff, behavior happening in Vietnam or World War II, it's basically like this guy isn't just going to survive, and to try and keep him alive is it could be, just causing him pain for an ultimate end, which is he's going to die anyhow. This kind of stuff that is being accused of for the Russians is, you're a burden. It's not worth it for us to take care of you. So we're gonna get rid of you because you're a problem,
right?
And that's that difference is
because your version of what is unsalvageable as a human being goes right in the toilet. They just drop to, if you're not going to be a soldier in a couple of weeks to continue this nonsense, you're not worth saving, and that's different than this person is obliterated beyond recognition and we can't save them even by moving them, to we could move you, we could save you, but you're going to lose your legs and maybe your arm, and we don't really care. We don't need you.
And we have to put you on a vehicle. We have to use one of our doctors. We have to use our support system to get you to the rear. Screw it.
That's where they're putting you. I'm putting you out of my misery, not out of yours.
Right. Exactly.
That's the distinction.
Look, I mean, these are really broad strokes we're talking about here, but generally, I do think that there is a difference in kind of how it's approached.
Right.
But there's another issue here, and that is, if they do survive, if these heavily wounded guys do survive, and they go back to Ekaterinburg or Volgograd or wherever they're from, Tomsk, Omsk, all these towns, and they live, and they've got, a missing arm, a missing leg. It is a visible, example of
they're a living example of how badly this is going. Right.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly. And more likely than not, they're not exactly going to tell the story of the glorious Russian army marching through Ukraine. They're going to be a little bit.
While we were talking, I burned right through the break. So we got to take one real quick, and then we'll come back after this. Hal Sparks radio program, mega worldwide, now with 100% more Johnny Million, and of course Philip Ittner joining us from Lviv in Ukraine. I want to talk about when we come back from the break, where you've gotten out to and what you've seen on the street and in your environment there. We'll be back right after
that. I have 3 questions so far.
Great.
Okay.
And Johnny Million will be taking questions from the chat.